Hey everyone, tonight we're beginning with something quieter, something softer. Not the great noise of battles or the clash of kings, but the stillness that comes before storms. This is a journey into a corner of the past where time moves slowly, where people lived with familiar rituals, never realizing how fragile it all was. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. That way, these stories, these quieter mysteries, can drift a little further, reaching others who might also be looking for a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, let me know your location and the exact time you're listening. I love seeing those small glowing lights across the map, all of us connected, quiet together though far apart. Before the thundering hooves of the Mongol cavalry reshaped continents, there was another world, quieter on the surface, though no less filled with hardship. The centuries leading into the 13th were marked by kingdoms, empires, and small states that believed themselves stable, even eternal. From the fortified towns of Europe to the wealthy cities of the Middle East, from the rice fields of China to the caravan markets of Central Asia, life moved in rhythms that people thought would last forever. It was a fragile balance, one that no one could imagine would soon be shattered by an empire unlike any seen before. In Europe, fragmented kingdoms ruled by dynasties claimed descent from ancient Romans and saints. Peasants bent their backs to the land, bishops built cathedrals of stone, and kings plotted wars against their neighbours. In the east, the Byzantine Empire still stood, though weakened, guarding the faded memory of Rome's grandeur. In the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad remained a centre of learning and religion, though its power had been chipped away by rival dynasties. Across Persia and Central Asia, dynasties rose and fell with the seasons. Traders carried silks, spices, and metals across long routes, and merchants dreamed of wealth that could cross mountains and deserts. To the south, in India, kingdoms built temples and palaces, layering stone upon stone as if permanence could be carved from marble. Across the seas in Japan, the emperor still reigned in name, though real power lay in the hands of shoguns and samurai families. In China, the Song dynasty flourished, cultivating a rich urban culture, producing porcelain and books, and fueling its economy with innovations like paper money. China believed itself to be the Middle Kingdom, destined to endure while others rose and fell. Its walls were tall, its cities vast, and its armies organised. It had faced nomads before, and it assumed it would face them again. But the steppes, the endless grasslands stretching from Hungary to Manchuria, were already stirring. To sedentary civilizations, the steppe seemed a wild and empty place, home only to horsemen and herds. Yet within its rolling fields and harsh winters lived countless tribes who moved with the seasons, surviving where no cities could be built. For centuries, these nomads raided and traded with the settled empires. Sometimes they hired themselves as mercenaries, sometimes they served as guards along caravan roads, and sometimes they descended in war bands that scattered armies not used to their speed. Civilizations learned to fear the steppe, but they also learned to dismiss it, assuming that nomads could never unite for long. This was the world before the Mongols, a world that thought it knew its patterns. Farmers planted in the spring, harvests came in the autumn, rulers collected their taxes, traders followed their caravans, and the rhythm of empires seemed steady. Wars erupted, of course, but they were wars between neighbours, wars that often ended in treaties or truces. Even when invaders came from the steppes, they struck quickly, seized plunder, and retreated back into the grasslands. Kingdoms rebuilt, walls were repaired, and life continued, as if the world itself would never truly change. Yet beneath this seeming stability lay fragility. Europe's kingdoms were divided, their kings as eager to fight each other as to defend against outside threats. The Abbasid caliphs ruled in name, but their power was hollow, their empire fractured into competing states. The wealthy cities of Persia and Central Asia thrived on trade, but their prosperity made them tempting targets. China's borders were long and its enemies numerous, and its armies, while disciplined, often struggled against the mobility of steppe horsemen. Even the proudest rulers relied on fragile alliances and the loyalty of subjects who could turn at the first sign of weakness. Life for ordinary people in this world was harsh, though familiar. A peasant in Europe tilled soil he did not own, bound by duties to lords who demanded both crops and labour. A merchant in Persia risked deserts and bandits for the chance of profit, travelling in caravans that moved like floating villages. A farmer in China might wake before dawn to tend rice paddies, knowing that a poor harvest could bring famine. Disease moved quietly along roads and rivers, claiming lives without warning. And war, when it came, was often local, fought with spears and swords, armies measured in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands. It was war that scarred but rarely obliterated. This was the fragile web of kingdoms and empires into which the Mongols would ride. A world where rulers could imagine their reigns lasting centuries, but where cracks already spread beneath the surface. The Silk Road carried goods, but also carried rivalries. The steppe tribes shifted, feuded, and forged alliances. Cities grew wealthy but also vulnerable. Few could imagine an empire that would rise from the grasslands, stretch across continents, and turn life itself into a death sentence for those caught beneath its hooves. To live before the Mongols was to live with expectations of continuity. Generations passed down traditions, convinced that their way of life would endure. Farmers planted crops in the same fields their ancestors had tended. Craftsmen built cathedrals and mosques to last for centuries. Poets and scholars wrote works they believed would outlive their empires. Even the rulers of the great dynasties thought of themselves as heirs to something ancient, guardians of an order that would not end. But the world they built rested on fragile foundations. The Mongols had not yet appeared as a united force. The tribes of the steppe still fought one another, their leaders seeking dominance but rarely holding it. Horses grazed on endless grasslands, herds moving with the seasons, clans moving with them. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Arrows flew from bows as naturally as words from the tongue, and life was measured by the strength of one's horse and the loyalty of one's kin. These tribes had raided and warred for centuries, but no settled ruler truly believed they could do more than that. They were storms that blew across the horizon, violent, dangerous, but fleeting. What no one realized was that the winds were changing. The fragile order of the settled world would soon collide with a power that demanded no treaties, built no cities at first, and recognized no borders. Before the Mongols, life was harsh, but it was familiar. After them, life itself would often feel like a sentence carried out by an empire that thrived on fear and conquest. The world before the Mongols was a world on the edge, though no one knew it. Empires dreamed of permanence, cities bustled with trade, scholars filled libraries, and peasants worked the land. Yet far beyond the ploughed fields and stone walls, across the seas of grass where the horizon seemed endless, a force was gathering. A force that would ride out of obscurity and make the very concept of safety feel like a memory. The stage was set, the actors unaware, and history waited in silence for the sound of hooves. From the quiet fields and bustling cities of the old world, our gaze drifts outward, into the rolling grasslands that stretch like an endless ocean. Here, Where no stone walls rose and no cities stood, life unfolded in motion. The steppe was not a place of permanence, but of movement, a landscape where survival meant following the herds, reading the winds, and never staying in one place for too long. To the empires at its edges, these lands seemed barren and empty, but for those who lived upon them, the steppe was everything. Their shelter, their livelihood, their battlefield. The riders of this world were born into the saddle. A child of the steppe learned to ride almost as soon as he could stand. Horses were not just animals, they were companions, wealth, and lifelines. A single family might own dozens, herds grazing under a sky that seemed to stretch forever. With them came mobility unmatched by any settled people. A Mongol rider could travel for days, sleeping in the saddle if needed, nourished by milk from his mare and meat dried at his side. This intimacy with the horse created a people who were not bound by terrain, who could appear at the horizon like a storm and vanish as quickly. Their homes were tents of felt, called gurs, round and sturdy against the winds. They could be dismantled and packed within an hour, ready to move with the herds. Inside, families gathered around small hearths, telling stories of ancestors and spirits, while outside, the land stretched on, seemingly endless, seemingly empty. But the emptiness was deceptive. Every hill, every stream, every patch of grazing land could be claimed, contested, fought over. Clans shifted with the seasons, alliances forming and dissolving, chiefs rising and falling. Life was a cycle of survival, yet also a proving ground where strength and loyalty meant everything. Weapons were as constant as the horse. The bow, light and curved, made from wood, horn and sinew, was the steppe's deadliest gift to warfare. From horseback, a rider could loose arrows with precision while galloping at full speed, shooting forward, backward, or to the side without breaking stride. No infantry line could easily withstand such speed and rain of missiles. Swords, spears, and damassos completed their arsenal, but it was the bow that defined their mastery. It allowed them to fight without closing, to harry an enemy into exhaustion, to disappear before a counterblow could land. To the settled kingdoms, these riders were both a threat and a curiosity. They came as raiders, burning villages, seizing herds, and retreating beyond the reach of revenge. Their attacks seemed sudden, unpredictable, and devastating, but also fleeting. Armies accustomed to sieges and slow marches could not grasp how men could live and fight while in constant motion. For centuries, dynasties and rulers tolerated them as a nuisance, sometimes paying them off, sometimes hiring them as mercenaries, sometimes attempting to crush them with limited success. Few believed that such people, scattered across the vastness of the steppe, could ever unite into something greater. Yet beneath the shifting alliances, there was a shared rhythm. The harshness of the land forged resilience. Winters bit deep, and only the strongest herds and families survived. Famine was common, and hunger drove raids as much as ambition. To live here meant to understand that tomorrow was not promised, that strength was the only shield, and that loyalty to one's kin was stronger than any law. In this crucible, a culture emerged that valued endurance, cunning, and above all, adaptability. It was a culture shaped not by palaces or scriptures, but by wind, hunger, and the relentless horizon. Religion, too, reflected this world. The steppe riders honoured spirits of the sky, the earth, the ancestors, and the eternal blue above them. The shaman, draped in furs and charms, stood as a mediator between the visible and invisible worlds, invoking protection or cursing enemies. Yet their beliefs were flexible. able to absorb new gods and new practices as they came into contact with foreign peoples. The riders of the steppe did not build temples, but they carried their spirits with them, as light and mobile as the tents they lived in. Trade flowed even here. Caravans crossed the grasslands, and steppe tribes both guarded and plundered them. Horses, hides and furs were exchanged for silks, grains and metals. Riders who could not produce wealth through farming produced it through movement, by seizing what others grew or by taxing those who passed through their lands. What seemed to the settled world as lawless plundering was, in truth, another form of economy, built upon mobility and force. But the riders were not only raiders, they were also skilled organisers of war, even before the rise of their great unifier. Clans drilled together, learning to ride in formations, learning to signal with flags and horns, learning to surround and scatter larger armies. Their wars were not fought for glory or territory in the way kings fought, but for survival, revenge, and dominance. Yet every battle honed their craft, and every season of hardship sharpened their instincts. The steppe, for all its harshness, was also a land of opportunity. A man born with nothing but a horse could, through bravery, loyalty, and cunning, rise to lead warriors. Status was earned as much as inherited. Leaders were tested in battle and in negotiation, and their power lasted only as long as they could protect their people and provide for them. This fluidity bred ambition, for men who might remain peasants in kingdoms could, on the steppe, rise to command thousands. Out of this soil of shifting loyalties and endless striving would come the figures who would reshape history. And so the riders appeared, not yet as conquerors of continents, but as shadows on the borders of empires, as bands of horsemen who could not be ignored. To the rulers of China, they were barbarians pressing against the northern walls. To the sultans of Persia, they were raiders who struck like lightning. To the princes of Russia, they were distant, scarcely considered. Yet these riders lived on the threshold of all these worlds, and their horizons stretched across them all. The empires that dismissed them as mere nomads had no sense of how fragile their own walls truly were. The steppe riders were a people shaped by hunger, by the open sky, and by the unyielding need to move. Their arrows flew across the plains like whispers of storms to come. They were not yet united, but their presence was constant, their skill unmatched, and their world, endless, restless, and waiting, would soon spill over into the lands of kings and emperors. From the grasslands, a shadow lengthened, carried by hooves, carrying with it the promise that life itself would soon change, and that for millions, survival under the Mongols would feel less like life and more like a sentence. Across the steppe, where the grass bent endlessly under the wind, life was tethered to the horse. To be born into this world was to be born into a bond so deep that existence itself could scarcely be imagined without it. Horses were not tools of war alone. They were the currency of wealth, the means of survival, and the truest companions a person could have. A man without horses was a man without life, as vulnerable as a tree uprooted from the soil. From the first breaths of childhood, the horse stood as both cradle and classroom. Children were set upon small ponies long before they could speak in full sentences, gripping manes with tiny hands, learning balance not by thought but by instinct. It was said that a boy who could not ride was no son of the steppe, and a girl who could not manage a herd was no daughter fit to marry. To fall from a horse was not failure but training, for the ground was as much a teacher as the saddle. By adolescence, the horse and rider were nearly indistinguishable, the movements of one flowing seamlessly into the other, as if bones and sinew extended from man to beast. Each family's herds defined its station. A clan that boasted hundreds of horses stood secure against hunger, trade, and enemies, while one with only a few teetered constantly on the edge of ruin. Herds were wealth in the most direct sense. They provided milk to drink, meat to eat, hides for clothing, and sinew for bows. The mare's milk, fermented into a sharp drink called kumis, sustained riders during long journeys, giving both strength and a sense of belonging to the life of the steppe. Horses carried burdens, pulled carts, and when the cold grew cruel, their very bodies offered warmth to those who clung to them in the night. The seasons revolved around the care of these animals. Summer meant fattening herds on lush pastures, while winter brought the constant threat of starvation. Riders cut through ice to let their horses drink, and in the cruelest months, animals and humans alike withered together. To lose a herd to frost, disease, or raid was to lose one's place in the world. Entire families could be broken by such misfortune, cast adrift among the clans with no anchor to sustain them. In such times, the bond between man and horse was not merely practical, but existential. Warfare too was measured by horses. An army of the steppe was not counted in foot soldiers or siege engines, but in riders and the animals beneath them. Each man carried not one horse but several, switching mounts so that none grew too weary, ensuring that the army could travel distances unimaginable to others. This gave the steppe riders the ability to appear and vanish like ghosts, striking far beyond the expected limits of movement. Their herds followed the army, a living tide of hooves, providing not only speed, but also sustenance, for a horse could be milked, bled, or slaughtered if the need grew dire. To the riders, the horse was more than flesh and bone. Songs were sung to them, charms tied to their bridles, and dreams told of spirits who rode the skies on celestial steeds. Horses were painted in tales as omens of fortune or disaster. To receive a strong horse as a gift was to receive not just an animal, but a promise of loyalty. To have one stolen was a wound to honour itself, a crime often punished more harshly than the theft of any other possession. Even in death, riders desired their horses near, sacrificed or buried with them, so that the journey into the afterlife might not be made on foot. The daily rhythm of life revolved around herding, training, and protecting these animals. Dawn often broke to the sound of whinnies and hooves, as herds were driven to fresh grazing. Children chased after foals, laughing and tumbling, their play already shaping them into future riders. Women milked mares, men checked saddles and bridles, and elders sat by fires recalling steeds of legendary swiftness or bravery. Stories of horses were woven into the fabric of memory, for each clan had its tales of animals who had carried warriors through impossible battles or guided families through deadly storms. Trade flowed through horses as well. A fine mount could be exchanged for silks, grain, or weapons, its value surpassing that of gold in many eyes. Envoys brought herds as tribute to powerful chiefs, and captives were often ransomed in horses rather than coin. Diplomacy itself was laced with the gift of steeds, a gesture of trust or a veiled demand. To offer a weak horse was an insult, to refuse one a grave slight. Thus, the animal that bore riders into war also bore the weight of alliances and rivalries across the steppe. But this dependence also bred desperation. Clans without herds looked to raids, their hunger driving them into conflict with neighbours. Herds could be seized as quickly as they could be lost, and entire fortunes shifted hands in a single night of fire and steel. The horse, so central to survival, was also a source of endless struggle. Wealth invited envy, weakness invited predators, and the endless cycle of raids kept the steppe in constant tension. For those who looked from the outside, this life seemed precarious, almost unbearable. How could a people tie their existence to animals that could sicken, scatter, or starve? Yet for the riders themselves, there was no other way to live. To walk was humiliation. To lack horses was ruin. The steppe itself was too vast, too demanding for any other form of life to endure. Horses were not only companions of survival, but also the measure of identity, shaping what it meant to belong to these windswept lands. As the clans shifted across the plains, their herds in constant motion, they did not yet know that this relationship would one day feed something larger than survival. It would give rise to an empire of hooves, a force that could stretch across continents, consuming kingdoms with the very speed and endurance that only the horse could grant. For the settled world, it was a bond they could scarcely comprehend. For the riders, it was as natural as breathing. Life on the steppe was measured not by the number of fields tilled, not by the stones of cities, but by the horses tethered outside one's tent. In their neighing and thunder lay the heartbeat of a people, a rhythm that would soon echo far beyond the grasslands. In those herds grazed not only survival, but the seeds of conquest, seeds that would one day make life under the Mongol Empire feel less like living and more like enduring the weight of a death sentence handed down by history itself. The herds and riders of the steppe, bound so tightly to the rhythm of grass and wind, seemed for centuries like a force confined to open horizons. Yet when ambition grew in the hearts of their leaders, the steppe spilled outward, pressing against the walls and gates of the settled world. And for the first time, the riders did not merely raid and vanish. They came not only for plunder, but for permanence, not only for herds, but for dominion. It was then that the Khans turned their gaze toward the cities, those vast clusters of stone and brick that had stood for generations as symbols of permanence against the fluid world of the plains. To the steppe mind, a city was both temptation and insult. Behind its walls lay grain to feed armies, treasures to enrich clans, artisans to serve new masters. But those same walls represented defiance, a statement that the riders of the plains could be kept out, that their world was less enduring than mortar and brick. The Khans understood this contradiction with ruthless clarity. They did not intend to simply breach the gates. They intended to demonstrate that no stone wall could stand before a tide of horses. The first encounters were brutal lessons for both sides. When Mongol riders arrived at the outskirts of towns, their speed and discipline confounded defenders used to sluggish sieges. They encircled settlements with frightening precision, cutting off all escape, then waited patiently as hunger gnawed at those inside. But if patience did not suffice, they brought terror as their tool. Siege weapons, learned from Chinese and Persian craftsmen, became part of their arsenal. Catapults hurled stones over battlements, towers rolled toward gates, and flaming projectiles lit the night skies above terrified inhabitants. The Khans did not invent siege warfare, but they wielded it with unmatched determination, blending their speed with the technology of those they conquered. The fate of a city often hinged on its choice: surrender or resistance. To those who submitted, the Khans sometimes offered mercy, lives spared, rulers left in place as tributaries, markets allowed to reopen. But to those who resisted, defiance carried a price beyond imagination. Entire populations were massacred, streets piled with bodies, rivers turned red with blood. Survivors were marched away as captives, artisans sent to distant capitals, children scattered as slaves. These acts were not merely vengeance, but a weapon in themselves. Word travelled faster than armies, and stories of annihilation could break the spirit of the next city before the riders even arrived. The Khans used fear as carefully as they used the bow. Terror was an instrument, sharpening their conquest more effectively than steel alone. To watch a city fall was to witness more than destruction. It was to feel the weight of inevitability, as if resistance itself had become futile. Some rulers, upon hearing that the Mongols were approaching, opened their gates at once, sparing their people but binding themselves to endless tribute. Others held out, trusting in walls that had withstood many enemies, only to discover that the riders did not retreat, as others had. Once the Khans fixed their eyes on a city, they rarely turned away until it was theirs. Whether in ruins or intact, for the people who lived in those cities, life changed in an instant. Generations of stability, markets filled with spices and silks, scholars reciting poetry in courtyards, all of it could vanish in a season. Where once there had been the hum of daily life, there might be silence, broken only by the scavengers picking through ruins. Even in spared cities, the presence of the Khan's envoys was a constant reminder that life now belonged to distant masters. Taxes increased, resources drained away, and every decision was weighed against the fear of what disobedience might bring. Yet the Khans were not destroyers for destruction's sake. They tore down resistance but built networks of control. Cities became nodes in a web that stretched across continents, linked by tribute, garrisons, and roads. Caravans moved under Mongol protection, carrying wealth that flowed not only into the coffers of Khans, but also into the markets of conquered lands. Where once cities looked inward, they were now bound outward, forced to serve an empire whose heart still beat on the open steppe. For many inhabitants, however, this transformation felt less like prosperity and more like suffocation. The rhythm of life under the Mongols was dictated by tribute demands, military levies, and the ever-present shadow of reprisal. To live in a conquered city was to live with the knowledge that survival had been purchased at the cost of submission. Every festival, every marketplace, every prayer in a mosque or cathedral unfolded under the gaze of an empire that demanded obedience above all. The memory of those who resisted lingered as warning. The ruins of cities left deliberately unrebuilt stood as silent monuments to defiance crushed. Travellers along the Silk Road passed these remains, whispering of what had happened there, carrying the tales farther than even the Mongols themselves could ride. This landscape of fear ensured that conquest could stretch across thousands of miles, not only on the strength of armies, but on the terror that preceded them. Inside the walls that once promised safety, people began to feel the walls as cages. The same stones that had been built to keep invaders out now held them under the gaze of new masters. Where kings and princes had once ruled, Mongol governors and envoys now demanded tribute, their authority enforced by the threat of riders who could return at any moment. The city, once a sanctuary from the dangers of the steppe, had become a place where the death sentence of empire could arrive without warning. The Khans did not simply take cities, they redefined them. They demonstrated that permanence was an illusion, that walls were fragile, that entire ways of life could vanish beneath hooves and fire. The people who survived carried this knowledge with them, woven into their daily existence like a shadow that never faded. Markets might reopen, scholars might return to their books, children might play in courtyards once more, but beneath it all was the unshakable truth that their lives were no longer their own. From the grasslands to the city gates, the Mongols had bridged two worlds, the restless mobility of the steppe and the fragile permanence of stone. In that union lay the essence of their empire, an empire where resistance was death, obedience was survival, and the cities that had once defined civilization found themselves bound beneath the will of Khans, who ruled not from palaces but from tents carried on the backs of horses. When the walls of cities no longer promised safety, what stretched between them became just as important. the empire of the Khans did not simply rest on shattered gates and conquered towns. It breathed through the roads that laced across its vast domain. These were not gentle paths of trade alone, but arteries of control, pulsing with both wealth and dread. They bound together lands that had never before been connected, linking the cold steppes to the fertile valleys, the deserts to the seas. And in that binding, they carried with them the unmistakable weight of Mongol power. The roads were more than dirt pressed beneath countless hooves. They were made of discipline, enforced by patrols that ensured no caravan dared stray without recognition of the Khan's authority. To step onto these routes meant stepping into the gaze of an empire that saw everything. Messengers could ride across continents with terrifying speed, their way cleared by stations that offered food, horses, and shelter. What once took months might now take weeks, and what once seemed impossible, the sharing of news from one end of Eurasia to the other, became routine under the watch of the Mongols. But the promise of movement carried with it the shadow of punishment. Travellers spoke of the watchtowers that dotted the routes, silent sentinels marking the land, each one a reminder that disobedience could never be hidden. A theft along the road, an insult to the Khan's envoys, even a whisper of rebellion, these did not vanish in the noise of distance. The empire's roads erased distance, carrying retribution as swiftly as they carried silk or grain. And so every merchant who loaded a camel, every pilgrim who set foot on the path, did so under the silent knowledge that the road itself demanded obedience. Fear was as much a companion on these journeys as the dust beneath sandals. Caravans moved not only with guards, but with whispers. At night, by the glow of fires, men told of towns erased for daring to defy point, of entire families punished because one member had dared raise a hand against an imperial messenger. Some of these stories were true, others exaggerated, but their power lay not in accuracy, but in inevitability. Along the Khan's roads, rumour itself became a weapon, deepening the sense that safety existed only in submission. For those who lived in villages and towns that dotted the routes, life was reshaped by the constant stream of riders and caravans. Supplies were demanded for passing troops, horses requisitioned, homes turned into resting stations. To refuse was to court disaster, and so people learned to give freely, though each gift was edged with fear. The road did not ask, it took, and in return, it offered only the knowledge that destruction might pass them by if they complied. Yet in this harsh order, there was a strange efficiency. Merchants found themselves able to move goods with less fear of bandits. Letters travelled from distant courts in astonishing time, carried by riders who switched horses at every station, moving day and night without pause. The empire had created a network so vast that some later would marvel at its brilliance. But for those who lived beneath it, this brilliance was a double-edged sword. To move freely was also to be seen clearly, and to be seen by the Mongols was to live always under their judgment. Even the silence of the road carried weight. When no caravans passed, when the horizon was empty, the people along its edges did not feel relief, but unease. For they knew that silence could mean the movement of armies, that emptiness might be the quiet before punishment arrived. Villages might be emptied to make way for supply routes, fields harvested not for those who tilled them, but for troops marching far away. The road demanded not only passage, but sustenance, and it took what it needed without regard for the people left behind. Travellers described the strange duality of these routes, safety and peril bound together. A merchant might travel from the Caspian to the Yellow Sea under Mongol banners, untouched by thieves, only to find himself ruined by the weight of taxes levied at every checkpoint. A pilgrim might walk unharmed through lands once torn by war, yet tremble at each station, unsure whether a single misstep might brand him as disrespectful to the Khan's messengers. To move was to survive, but also to remain constantly aware that life itself could be stripped away as easily as a horse exchanged at a station. The roads also became rivers of tribute. From every conquered land, wealth flowed outward, streaming toward the centres of power. Grain, textiles, metals, spices, all of it passed along these arteries, a constant reminder that the empire thrived not on generosity, but on the labour and loss of its subjects. To see the caravans was to see not prosperity, but extraction, each laden camel or ox cart a symbol of what had been taken. For the ordinary people, it was not wealth that the road brought, but depletion. Fear gave these roads their permanence. Stones could be pried loose, bridges rebuilt, but the memory of punishment was harder to erase. Villages abandoned after resisting conscription, towns burned for obstructing tribute. These scars remained visible long after armies had moved on, and they served as warnings to all who travelled the same paths. The road was not simply a route across land, but a tether binding lives to the empire's will. At times, even nature seemed reshaped by these networks. Forests were cleared to make room for passes, rivers bridged to ensure movement, grasslands trampled by endless waves of hooves, the land itself bent under the pressure of connection, reshaped not for those who dwelled upon it, but for those who ruled from afar. People learned to live along the edges of these transformations, adjusting to a rhythm that was no longer their own, but dictated by riders who might appear at any moment. In the stillness of night, when caravans halted and fires burned low, the roads revealed their true character. They were not neutral paths, but instruments of empire, stretching endlessly across the horizon, each mile heavy with the weight of submission. Those who walked them carried more than goods or messages. They carried the knowledge that the Khan's reach had no limit, that the world itself had been bound into a network of fear. And as dawn broke and the riders mounted once again, the dust of the road rose behind them, settling over the land like a reminder that escape was impossible, that every step was watched, and that survival under the Mongol Empire was never guaranteed. Along the roads that stitched the empire together, caravans carried more than trade. They bore the weight of obligation, the endless stream of payments demanded by the Khans. Every conquered land was bound not only by fear, but by tribute, the lifeblood that fed the steppe rulers and their armies. To live under their shadow was to live under a ledger, where survival itself was calculated in grain, livestock, coin, and labour. Submission was measured not in words, but in what could be given, and in how swiftly it could be taken. Tribute was not always the same, for the Khans were practical as much as ruthless. From fertile valleys, they demanded grain. From artisans' quarters, they seized cloth, tools, and craft. From wealthy towns, they took coin and gold. Livestock was prized most of all, herds driven away as easily as caravans of treasure. No resource escaped their reach. Even people themselves became part of the tribute. Skilled workers uprooted and sent far away. Children counted among the wealth of empire. Women seized to fill households or serve as bargaining tokens in marriage alliances. A family might find itself broken apart, not by war, but by the cold demands of tribute collectors. The system promised safety in return. Rulers who paid regularly and fully were spared annihilation, their lands allowed to function beneath the imperial gaze. Markets stayed open, temples were not defiled, and homes could stand. But this safety was fragile, for the line between tribute and torment was thin, and the Khans crossed it whenever it suited them. One late delivery, one miscalculation in weight or number, one hint of withheld wealth, and the punishment came swiftly. Soldiers would descend not only to seize what was owed, but to multiply the burden, stripping homes bare, driving people from their villages, making examples of those too slow or too proud to meet the demands. For common people, tribute was a sentence without end. Taxes bled into labour, and labour bled into hunger. A man who gave his grain to collectors had less to feed his children. A craftsman who surrendered his goods had less to barter in the market. And yet refusal was impossible, for refusal invited torments far worse than deprivation. To survive meant to give, even when giving hollowed out the very marrow of life. Collectors did not travel alone. They arrived with guards whose presence turned every transaction into a performance of submission. Villagers were summoned, their goods weighed, their animals counted. Those who tried to hide even the smallest portion risked being dragged into the open, beaten, or worse. Sometimes the collectors demanded more than what was decreed, enriching themselves under the authority of the Khan. To complain was futile, for no one stood between the subject and the empire. Justice flowed in only one direction, downward from the Khans, and its weight always favoured those who enforced their rule. The memory of punishments lingered long after collectors left. Villages that resisted found themselves burned, their people scattered. Heads of defiant rulers were displayed on stakes, their fate a warning to others. In some regions, tribute became so unbearable that communities fled, abandoning fields and homes, seeking shelter in wilderness or mountains where the roads could not easily reach. Yet even there, the empire's reach stretched farther than expected. Riders could appear without warning, smoke could rise where a village once stood, and the lesson repeated itself until obedience replaced defiance. But tribute was not only a burden, it was also a chain that bound distant peoples together under one authority. Goods from faraway lands flowed through Mongol hands, redistributed to reward loyal generals or strengthen the empire's centres. A farmer in the Black Sea region might see his grain vanish into carts bound for Central Asia. A weaver in China might see her cloth carried westward, draped on the shoulders of men she would never meet. The scale of extraction was so vast that entire economies sent under its weight, their purpose transformed from sustaining local communities to feeding the endless appetite of the Khans. This appetite was not simply greed, it was also a performance of power. Tribute was a visible reminder that the conquered had no sovereignty left. Each payment reaffirmed submission. Each delivery confirmed dependence. To bring offerings to a Mongol governor was to bow twice, once in the giving, and again in the unspoken acknowledgement that refusal meant death. This theatre of obedience played out endlessly, repeated across towns and villages, becoming the rhythm of life under the empire. The fear of torment kept the system alive. Parents taught their children to bow low when soldiers passed, to never question collectors, to remain silent even when demands seemed impossible. Generations learned to live beneath the weight of obligation, shaping their lives around what would be taken rather than what could be built. Hope shrank to the size of a meal, a roof unburned, a night without soldiers at the door. And yet, beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Songs whispered of lost freedoms, of ancestors who had lived without tribute. Old men remembered days when walls meant protection and roads meant trade, not fear, but such memories were dangerous, and so they were spoken softly, behind closed doors, as if the very dust of the roads might carry them to the ears of the Khans. For those who lived in that time, silence became a second form of tribute, paid in words withheld, in thoughts never spoken. The empire thrived on this balance of giving and dread. Tribute filled its coffers, armies enforced its demands, and the cycle continued. For those trapped within it, there was no choice but endurance. To survive was to pay. To pay was to submit. And to submit was to accept that the difference between life and torment was measured not by justice, but by the whims of distant rulers whose riders could appear at any moment, turning the promise of safety into ash. The wealth pulled from tribute and the fear carried along the roads did not bring stillness. For the Mongol world, conquest was not a moment, but a condition, a rhythm that beat as steadily as the hooves of their horses. What had been taken became fuel for what would be taken next. Grain from conquered valleys fed soldiers. Craftsmen from broken cities built weapons, and captives filled the ranks that stretched across horizons. The empire moved forward, not with pauses of reflection, but with an appetite that seemed without end. To live under such a force was to realize that conquest did not pass by once and vanish. It rolled onward like a storm, gathering strength as it moved, pressing into lands that had thought themselves distant, secure, or forgotten by history. No boundary held. Rivers, deserts, and mountains, which for centuries had divided peoples and shielded kingdoms, became mere obstacles to be crossed. Where the land broke, the Mongols adapted. Where water spread wide, they built fleets or conscripted those who had long known how to sail. Each barrier, once considered unyielding, crumbled before the relentless will of the Khans. The march was not chaotic, but deliberate, driven by a discipline that unnerved their enemies. Scouts rode far ahead, mapping every valley and settlement. Intelligence moved faster than rumour, carried by a courier system so efficient that it made the empire feel omnipresent. Armies appeared not as wandering hordes, but as orchestrated waves, their movements timed and measured, as if conquest itself had become a craft refined over generations. For those in the path of this march, terror often arrived before the soldiers themselves. Refugees streamed from conquered lands, their stories filling the air of markets and temples. Whispers of burning towns and enslaved children travelled faster than caravans. To hear these tales was to sense the future pressing near, to feel the walls of one's own city suddenly thinner, weaker, less certain. People looked to their rulers for protection, but rulers themselves were divided. Some chose to fight, others to bend, and all of them knew that their choice carried the weight of thousands of lives. The endless conquest was not only military, it was psychological. The knowledge that the empire never stopped moving created an atmosphere of permanent dread. Even after submission, even after tribute was given, there lingered the thought that more might be demanded, that conquest itself could circle back, pressing again and again until nothing remained. People did not see peace as resolution, but as a pause between waves, temporary and fragile. Cities that lay along trade routes learned this truth most keenly. One season, they were marketplaces alive with travellers from distant lands. The next, they were staging grounds for armies marching west or south. Fields that once fed local communities were seized to sustain soldiers, livestock driven away to provision campaigns. The economy of survival bent itself toward the needs of conquest, until every household, every farm, every workshop was, in one way or another, drawn into the machine of war. The Khans themselves understood the importance of momentum. To stop was to risk weakness, to allow enemies to regroup, to let fear fade. So their campaigns followed one another in a rhythm as merciless as the seasons. Winter camps turned into spring assaults. Victories in summer stretched into sieges that carried through autumn. Generals dispersed and reunited, moving like streams that split and rejoined, spreading destruction with such coordination that entire regions collapsed without hope of recovery. For soldiers conscripted from conquered peoples, the march of conquest was both a curse and a prison. Many were forced to fight against lands they once called kin, driven into battles where survival meant killing for the very empire that had enslaved them. They carried the weight of fear in two directions: fear of the Mongols behind them, fear of the enemies before them. Their loyalty was never chosen, only enforced, and their lives were spent like coin in campaigns that cared nothing for their survival. Ordinary people, left behind in villages and towns, felt the march of conquest even without seeing the armies. Their sons were taken for war, their daughters as hostages, their wealth drained to fuel battles fought far beyond their borders. Each victory of the empire meant a deeper wound for those who supported it unwillingly. And yet, resistance seemed unthinkable, for every story of rebellion ended with the same images: ruins where homes had stood, silence where families once laughed, emptiness where once there had been life. The endless march reshaped the very imagination of the world. Lands that had long thought themselves apart from one another suddenly found their fates entangled. A merchant in Persia felt the impact of conquests in China. A farmer in Rus lost his grain to feed armies marching in the Middle East. The empire bound together regions that had never before been connected, but it did so not with shared prosperity, but with shared fear. Distance no longer offered safety. Even the rulers of distant kingdoms, those who had not yet seen Mongol riders at their gates, lived in dread. Envoys arrived bearing demands for submission, backed not by the presence of soldiers, but by the certainty of what refusal would bring. Letters of warning, often written in the blood of the conquered, made their way across courts, forcing kings and princes to weigh the impossible choice between humiliation and annihilation. For the people themselves, the endless march meant that life was always provisional. Today might bring survival, tomorrow conquest, and no one could say where the horizon of safety truly lay. The empire's strength was not only in its armies, but in this sense of inevitability, the belief that no matter where one stood, the riders would eventually arrive. And so the march continued, not as an event, but as a condition of existence. It did not stop at borders, it did not pause with seasons, and it did not end with victories. It pressed forward ceaselessly, reshaping the world into a place where survival meant submission, where the very rhythm of history seemed to beat in time with hooves, and where life itself felt like a sentence carried out beneath the shadow of a power that never rested. The march of conquest did not simply sweep across the world and move on. It lingered, embedding itself in the lives of those who survived. Cities that had surrendered or been rebuilt under the Khans did not feel liberated from war. Instead, they carried its weight in every detail of daily existence. The banners of the empire might flutter above their walls, but beneath them, the people lived like captives in the very places they had once called home. Life under Mongol rule was not marked by freedom, but by the constant awareness of surveillance. Garrisons were stationed in strategic cities, their presence a reminder that even if a population appeared calm, suspicion never fully faded. Soldiers did not need to be everywhere for fear to do their work. A few men at the gates, a patrol through the markets, an occasional display of punishment, all were enough to keep thousands obedient. Silence became a kind of survival, for words carried further than anyone intended. In villages and towns, people felt the weight of control not through constant violence, but through the knowledge that violence could be summoned at any moment. The Khans had little tolerance for defiance. If taxes were delayed, if tribute seemed incomplete, if rumours of rebellion stirred, retribution was swift and merciless. Families lived in the shadow of these possibilities, never knowing if the knock at their door might bring demands that would strip them of their possessions, or worse, their lives. For farmers, captivity was felt most sharply in the land itself. Fields once owned by families for generations were claimed by the empire, parcelled out as rewards to Mongol leaders, or turned into estates for loyal allies. The people who had worked the soil became tenants on what had once been theirs, labouring under quotas that left them little for themselves. Grain was measured, livestock tallied, and households pressed to produce beyond their means. To fall short was to risk punishment, yet to meet the demands often meant hunger in one's own home. Craftsmen and artisans fared no better. The Mongols recognised their skills and valued their work, but this did not bring prosperity. Instead, it meant being bound to the needs of the empire. Metalworkers were ordered to fashion weapons, masons to build fortifications, weavers to supply fabrics for armies on the move. Their artistry no longer belonged to them, and their labour was demanded not as trade, but as obligation. What they created became the property of their conquerors, and refusal was not an option. Merchants found themselves entangled in a paradox. The empire prided itself on the vast web of trade it controlled, stretching across continents. Roads were guarded, caravans permitted to pass, and markets linked as never before. Yet the wealth this movement generated rarely stayed with those who risked the journeys. Taxes, tariffs, and seizures cut deeply into their profits, and the knowledge that soldiers could appropriate goods at any moment turned every transaction into a gamble. Trade routes that had once been paths of opportunity became avenues of survival, where merchants carried not only wares, but the unspoken weight of empire on their backs. Even spiritual life did not escape the feeling of captivity. Temples, mosques, and churches were often allowed to function, for the Mongols were pragmatic in matters of faith. But priests, monks, and imams knew that their words were not entirely free. To preach rebellion, even subtly, was to invite destruction not only upon oneself, but upon an entire community. Rituals continued, prayers were spoken, bells rang, but behind them all lingered an awareness that the gods might be watching, yet the Khans were listening too. Captivity also took the form of displacement. Entire populations were uprooted and moved to serve the empire's designs. Skilled workers from one land were transported to another, placed in cities far from their homes, where their talents could be used to enrich their new masters. Families were split apart, with husbands sent to distant armies, and wives left behind in villages, now controlled by foreign overseers. Children grew up in places their parents had never known, speaking languages their ancestors had not spoken, shaped not by the heritage of their people, but by the demands of the Khans. The sense of being captive was not only physical, but also psychological. Stories and traditions once passed proudly from one generation to the next were now spoken in whispers, if at all. To remember too openly what life had been like before was dangerous, for it carried the suggestion that the present was unjust. And so memory itself became restrained, bent under the weight of survival. People lived between what they could recall and what they dared to say, their own history slipping quietly from their grasp. The empire's laws reinforced this sense of imprisonment. Justice, such as it was, favoured the conquerors. Mongol nobles enjoyed privileges denied to common people, and disputes involving soldiers or officials often ended in favour of the powerful. Ordinary men and women understood that their rights existed only in theory, for any appeal might be overturned by the will of a commander. To live under such a system was to know that fairness had become a word without meaning, a hollow sound against the stone walls of courts that served the empire's interests first. And yet, even in this atmosphere, people tried to endure. Families planted crops, tended animals, and carried on the tasks of daily life, because to stop was to invite ruin. Markets reopened, craftsmen continued their work, children played in alleys and courtyards. Survival demanded a kind of quiet persistence, an acceptance that life must continue even when freedom was absent. But beneath this surface, the knowledge of captivity never disappeared. It pressed upon every decision, shaped every conversation, and coloured every dream. The Mongol Empire had built its strength on conquest, but its endurance rested on this web of control. To make people captives in their own lands was more effective than chains or prisons. It required no walls, no guards, only the constant presence of fear and the unspoken memory of what happened to those who resisted. Cities could be rebuilt, fields replanted, roads repaired, but the spirit of submission left behind by conquest was harder to erase. It lived on in the silence of the people, in the caution of their steps, in the way they lowered their eyes when soldiers passed. Thus the empire expanded, not only by taking new lands, but by holding the conquered in a grip that was both visible and unseen. The banners of the Khans proclaimed power, but the true strength of the Mongols lay in the way they turned entire populations into prisoners without chains, captives within their own walls, living reminders that survival under the empire was itself a kind of sentence. Captivity in daily life was not only measured by silence or obedience, it also took form in the relentless demands of tribute and taxation, which pressed down upon every household with a weight as heavy as chains. The Mongol Empire did not simply conquer, it expected to be sustained by those it had conquered. The fields, the markets, the very breath of labour were transformed into streams of wealth flowing upward, away from the hands that earned them and into the coffers of the Khans. Taxes were not uniform, nor were they predictable. In some regions, they took the form of grain levies, tallied by officials who walked from field to field, marking down the yield and seizing what the empire claimed. In others, livestock served as the currency of obligation. Horses, sheep, and cattle counted, branded, and driven away to feed armies that seemed never to rest. Craftsmen paid with their skills, merchants with their goods, peasants with their toil, and entire towns with whatever could be stripped from them when quotas fell short. The collection itself was a performance of authority. Officials arrived not as humble accountants, but as representatives of a power that brooked no resistance. They came with soldiers at their backs, scribes with ledgers, and an unspoken understanding that these visits were less about fairness than about intimidation. Families stood by as their possessions were inspected, their animals herded, their grain measured. To speak against the process was folly. To question the numbers was dangerous. The empire's sums were always correct, even when they left a household bare. For the poor, the burden was often unbearable. Many families lived so close to the edge of survival that any excess demanded by the empire meant hunger. Children grew thin, winters stretched longer, and illness spread more easily in households stripped of food. Yet the demands did not ease, for the Khans measured loyalty in tribute, and excuses, however reasonable, were treated as disobedience. In this way, taxes were not only a financial weight, but a constant reminder of vulnerability. Wealthier subjects fared differently, though not necessarily better. Their larger herds or fuller storerooms drew the eye of collectors who saw in them opportunities to extract more. Nobles and merchants who once commanded respect in their own societies found themselves bargaining for scraps of their own wealth, their status reduced to the mercy of Mongol officials. Gold, silver, and silks were demanded as readily as grain, and the possessions that once marked prestige became liabilities, attracting attention from those who had the power to take them. Some cities tried to turn the burden into order by organising the taxes themselves, appointing local leaders to oversee the process and deliver the quota. But this only shifted resentment inward. Villagers blamed their own representatives for the losses they endured, while those representatives lived under the constant threat of punishment should they fail to deliver enough. Entire communities fractured beneath the strain, suspicion gnawing at the bonds that once held neighbours together. The empire justified these exactions by claiming they ensured stability. Tribute, it was said, paid for the soldiers who guarded the roads, the officials who maintained law, the vast machinery that allowed goods to move from one end of the continent to the other. In a sense, it was true. The roads were safer than they had been in centuries, bandits curbed, caravans permitted to travel distances unimaginable before. Yet for the common people, the cost of this order far outweighed its benefits. What use was a safe road if the goods they produced along it were already seized before they could sell them? What value was protection if it came at the expense of one's own survival? Over time, taxes became less a system than a cycle of extraction. Soldiers needed food, horses needed fodder, officials needed salaries, and campaigns demanded endless supplies. The empire consumed, and it consumed relentlessly. From the outside, the machine seemed efficient, a marvel of administration stretching across mountains, deserts, and rivers. From within, it was a constant drain, an appetite that never seemed satisfied. Families who once dreamed of modest prosperity came to dream only of making it through another season without losing everything, and yet resistance rarely appeared in open form. The memory of entire towns burned for lesser offences kept most people obedient. Instead, defiance took quieter shapes. A farmer might hide a portion of grain beneath the floorboards, hoping the collectors would overlook it. A shepherd might drive a few animals into the hills before the officials arrived. Merchants might conceal the true weight of their cargo, offering bribes to inspectors willing to look away. These small acts were dangerous, but they were also necessary, for without them, many would not have survived. Still, the empire had ways of uncovering deceit. Informants were rewarded, punishments made public, and examples set with brutal clarity. A family caught hiding grain might see its house torn down. A village accused of concealing livestock might be forced to surrender twice the quota. Fear spread not only of the collectors, but of one's own neighbours, for anyone might be tempted to betray another if it meant easing their own burden. Trust frayed, and with it, the sense of community that had once been a source of strength. The taxes did more than take possessions, they reshaped identities. A man was no longer known only as a farmer, but as a supplier of grain to the Khan. A woman's weaving was measured not as artistry, but as material for tribute. Children grew up counting the seasons not by harvest or festival, but by the dreaded visits of the tax collectors. The empire pressed itself into every corner of life, turning existence itself into a form of service. Thus, the conquered became both subjects and sustenance, feeding a system that thrived on their exhaustion. To live under Mongol rule was to know that each year would bring another reckoning, another stripping away, another demand that pushed survival to its limits. Death did not always come from the sword or the spear. It came from the quiet, relentless erosion of life by the burdens imposed from above. The Khans ruled with horses and armies, but equally with ledgers and quotas. Their power lay not only in the thunder of hooves, but in the scratch of the scribe's pen, tallying what would be taken, marking what would be left. For those who lived beneath this system, the weight of taxation was not merely an obligation. It was a sentence, binding them to a future that seemed always smaller, narrower, and more uncertain than the past they had lost. Life beneath Mongol rule was not shaped by the soldiers alone. Between the weight of taxes and the watchful eyes of the empire, another force threaded through daily existence, the ever-present shadow of merchants and spies. Some wore the cloak of trade, others the veil of loyalty. but together they formed the invisible lattice that held the conquered world in place. Roads filled with caravans gave the illusion of prosperity, yet behind the clatter of hooves and the rustle of silks lay a system designed to observe, report, and bind. Merchants were the lifeblood of the empire's arteries. They travelled across deserts, forests, and mountains, their carts piled with goods that dazzled markets from Samarkand to Constantinople. To many, they appeared as mere traders, driven by profit, but their journeys were never simply their own. The Khans saw them as instruments of empire, eyes and ears as much as carriers of silk or spice. A merchant who passed through villages gathered not only wares but whispers, and each whisper was more valuable than gold when carried back to officials who relied on information as much as tribute. Suspicion clung to these figures like dust on their robes. Locals welcomed their wares, but never fully trusted them, for no one could know whether the man selling bolts of cloth was also noting which villages seemed prosperous, which harboured resentment, which whispered of rebellion in the quiet of the night. Conversations at market stalls were guarded, laughter restrained, because one careless word might ride back with the caravans and return as punishment at the hands of the empire's enforcers. Spies did not always announce themselves with secrecy. Many walked openly, bearing imperial insignias, asking questions with the calm authority of those who expected to be answered. They might appear as scribes recording numbers, officials inspecting roads, or even scholars inquiring about customs. Yet beneath these roles, their task was singular: to know and to report. Resistance was not needed to invite their scrutiny. Simple discontent was enough. A sigh at the tax burden, a grumble about the soldiers, a refusal to bow quickly enough, small details could swell into accusations of disloyalty once written into the records. Even silence offered little refuge. The empire did not rely solely on outsiders to spy. It wove its system into the very fabric of communities. Neighbours became informants, sometimes willingly, sometimes out of fear, sometimes in the hope of easing their own obligations by pointing to another's faults. Friendships frayed under the weight of doubt. A meal shared could be remembered later as evidence of conspiracy. A conversation about hardship could reappear in the mouth of a loyal subject, eager to protect himself by offering the words of another. Trust became scarce, and the empire thrived on its absence. The atmosphere of surveillance was not loud but heavy, a pressure that filled the air like smoke. Villages knew they were watched even when no official stood in the square. Markets carried a hush beneath their noise, as if every transaction were performed beneath an unseen gaze. At night, behind closed doors, families whispered, for even the walls felt unreliable. Children were told to guard their tongues, to repeat nothing they heard at home, for the innocence of youth offered no shield if their words reached the wrong ears. Merchants, meanwhile, carried stories as carefully as they carried jade or spices. Their roots stretched across continents, and with them flowed a river of knowledge. They reported the conditions of roads, the mood of towns, the abundance or scarcity of crops. They noted which regions prospered under imperial order and which simmered with unrest. For the Khans, such intelligence was as valuable as taxes, for it allowed them to rule from afar, confident that their reach extended even where their armies did not stand. The blending of commerce and espionage gave the empire both its strength and its suffocating grip. Trade flourished, but it was not free. A merchant who prospered did so under the empire's shadow, always aware that his fortune could be seized or his loyalty questioned. Success itself was dangerous, for wealth drew attention, and attention could become suspicion. Yet failure offered no relief, for poverty was interpreted not as misfortune but as negligence, perhaps even as rebellion through idleness. ordinary people bore the weight of this hidden system in quiet, exhausting ways. To speak with a merchant meant balancing politeness with caution. To host a traveller for the night meant wondering what he would carry forward in his memory. To sell a loaf of bread or a cup of wine was to perform not only a transaction, but an act of survival, ensuring that nothing said or done might appear ungrateful or disloyal. Fear of spies extended beyond words into actions. Rituals of loyalty multiplied. Gestures of obedience became exaggerated, because to appear careless was to invite suspicion. A bow held too briefly, an offering made too lightly, a greeting spoken without enough warmth. These small lapses could be reported as signs of hidden defiance. And once written into the Empire's records, even the smallest sign of resistance became truth, regardless of its reality. The system of watchers created an empire where rebellion was not only crushed, but prevented, not by force alone, but by the steady erosion of trust. Each person carried within them the knowledge that they were never unobserved. Each village understood that its silence could not protect it, for silence itself could be interpreted as disloyalty. The result was a society that bent without breaking, a conquered world that learned to survive by swallowing its voice. To live beneath such scrutiny was to walk a path lined not only with soldiers, but with shadows. The merchants who brought goods brought uncertainty. The spies who asked questions sowed fear. The neighbours who smiled in daylight might repeat your words in the night. And through it all, the empire listened, not with ears alone, but with a network of eyes that never closed. The Khans ruled not only with armies, but with silence. The silence of people who dared not speak freely, who measured their words as carefully as they measured their grain for taxes. It was a silence that spread from markets to homes, from families to entire cities, until the conquered world seemed hushed beneath the weight of watchfulness. In that silence, the Mongol Empire endured, its strength drawn not only from the swords of its warriors, but from the quiet surrender of those who lived under the gaze of merchants, spies, and silent watchers. Justice beneath the Mongol Empire was less a system of fairness than a reflection of power. It was shaped by the will of the Khans, enforced through their representatives, and feared by those who lived beneath their rule. To survive meant not only paying taxes and bowing to authority, but also navigating a world where punishment could descend suddenly, decisively, and often without recourse. In such an environment, the very idea of justice twisted into something unrecognizable, a tool not of balance, but of domination. The empire's rulers spoke of law as if it were sacred. The Yasa, attributed to Genghis Khan, was said to be the backbone of their order. Its words were rarely written down, but carried in the memory of officials and enforced without mercy. It encompassed matters great and small, rules about loyalty, about theft, about family, even about the conduct of soldiers. But what mattered was not the letter of these laws, but the way they were wielded. The empire's strength lay in consistency of punishment, not in fairness of judgment. If one village defied an order, it was erased. If one person disobeyed, they were broken as an example to the rest. The effect was chilling. People obeyed less out of respect than out of terror. The weight of this justice fell most heavily on the conquered. Mongol nobles enjoyed certain protections, their word carrying more weight than the lives of commoners. For those who tilled the soil, tended animals, or traded in markets, justice meant being vulnerable to the sudden judgment of an official or soldier. A complaint against authority was dangerous. Even an accidental slight could become grounds for execution. And when punishment was delivered, it was not subtle. Public displays of death or mutilation were common, staged, so that entire communities would see and remember. Justice was as much performance as it was penalty. Travellers along the empire's roads often remarked on the eerie safety of the routes. Banditry all but disappeared, for the Mongols punished theft with uncompromising severity. A man caught stealing a horse could lose his life. Even petty crimes, in some regions, drew punishments so harsh they left no room for repeat offenders. On the surface, this created order, but beneath it simmered fear. People did not refrain from crime out of belief in right or wrong. They refrained because they knew a single act could erase not just themselves, but their families. Justice was not confined to criminal acts. It extended into the everyday obligations of subjects. Failing to deliver tribute could be seen as treason. Hiding grain from tax collectors might bring ruin on a household. Refusing hospitality to a Mongol official, even for lack of resources, could mean punishment far out of proportion to the act. Law blurred into domination until the two became indistinguishable. Every action carried potential danger. Every misstep a possible sentence. Yet the empire's rulers prided themselves on being impartial in their own way. The same law that struck down peasants also bound generals. A commander who disobeyed orders, no matter how powerful, risked death. Entire families of nobles were purged if their loyalty faltered. It was said that the Khans could not be bribed, that their law treated treachery the same, whether it came from a shepherd or a prince. But impartiality is not fairness, and the impartial cruelty of Mongol justice was simply another reminder that no one, high or low, could feel truly safe. For ordinary people, the unpredictability of this justice weighed heavily on the spirit. Villages could be obliterated for sheltering fugitives. Individuals could vanish for words spoken in private. The permanence of punishment, swift, absolute, and final, created an atmosphere where hesitation replaced action and silence replaced speech. Survival meant learning to live quietly, never drawing attention, never stepping into the uncertain light of authority. Some found ways to navigate this system. Local leaders acted as intermediaries, pleading for their people when possible, translating the harsh commands of officials into words their subjects could bear. Merchants, accustomed to dealing with rulers across many lands, adapted their tongues to avoid offence. Families raised children with lessons of caution. To bow deeply, to speak softly, to never question the demands of those in power. But no amount of care could provide complete protection, for justice in the shadow of the Khan was not predictable. It was as swift as a storm, and as merciless as fire. The cruelty of punishment was matched by its spectacle. Executions were carried out before crowds, reminders of the cost of disobedience. Tales spread of men trampled beneath horses, of rebels boiled alive, of entire populations slaughtered to erase the possibility of defiance. Whether every story was true mattered little. The whispers themselves were enough to deepen the fear, enough to convince people that resistance was futile. Justice became a theatre in which the empire performed its power, and the audience learned the lesson by heart. Obedience meant life. Disobedience meant death. And yet, beneath this weight, people endured. They tilled their fields, traded their goods, raised their children, and whispered prayers that their households would escape notice. In their endurance, they revealed the paradox of Mongol rule. Justice, as the Khans defined it, was meant to enforce submission, yet it also crushed the spirit that might have created genuine loyalty. Fear held the empire together, but fear also hollowed the lives of those within it. Living under such a system was like walking in perpetual twilight. The sun might shine, markets might bustle, children might laugh, but always there was the knowledge that shadow lay close. At any moment, the empire could turn its gaze, and when it did, the definition of justice would be rewritten by the needs of the Khan. In that shadow, people learned to live not with hope, but with caution, not with freedom, but with endurance. Justice under the Mongols was not a balance between right and wrong. It was the weight of an empire pressing down, the cold certainty that laws served power, and that life itself could be measured in loyalty or disobedience. For those who lived beneath it, survival was not a guarantee. It was a fragile state, preserved only so long as one remained invisible in the shadow of the Khan. Where the Mongol armies marched, death marched with them. It came not only by sword or arrow, not only in the smoke of burning cities or the silence of emptied villages, but in something far quieter, far more insidious. The empire's reach stretched across deserts, steppes, and seas, and with it moved invisible companions, diseases that clung to skin, nestled in the breath of the living, and spread faster than even the swiftest riders. The empire prided itself on the vast roads and caravan trails that stitched together half the known world, yet these same arteries carried not just trade, but pestilence. The soldiers themselves were perfect hosts. They rode endlessly, their lives spent on horseback, their bodies pushed to exhaustion by campaigns that never seemed to end. Cuts, bruises, and untreated wounds became breeding grounds for infection. The close quarters of camps turned fevers into epidemics. And wherever they paused, whether on the outskirts of a Chinese town, in the fields of Persia, or at the gates of Eastern Europe, they left behind more than the memory of conquest. They left sickness that lingered long after their departure. The empire's conquests brought once distant peoples into sudden, unsettling contact. A merchant from the Middle East might find himself bargaining beside a trader from the steppes, or a sailor from the Indian Ocean. Each carried not only goods, but germs unknown to others. Diseases that had once burned out in isolated regions found new hosts and fresh fuel. Illnesses that a village might have endured as seasonal afflictions became lethal when introduced to populations without defences. The Black Death, centuries later remembered as one of the greatest calamities in human history, followed in the wake of Mongol expansion. Rats and fleas travelled with caravans, hidden in bales of cloth, gnawing at sacks of grain, clinging to the very structures of trade. Soldiers laying siege to cities carried the disease as well, their catapults hurling not only stones, but, on occasion, the infected corpses of their own fallen. A grotesque weapon that spread plague as surely as any arrow. The vast empire that once prided itself on safe passage for merchants became the very channel through which pestilence flowed across continents. For those living under Mongol rule, the terror of disease was inseparable from the terror of conquest. A village might survive the approach of the army, surrender its tribute, and bow before the Khan's authority, only to watch its people waste away days later from unseen enemies that no surrender could appease. Illness blurred the line between punishment and chance, between fate and empire. To the common eye, it seemed as though the Mongols carried curses with them, a punishment that lingered long after the warriors had gone. Doctors of the time could do little. Local healers relied on herbs, charms, or rituals, but these did nothing to stop the unseen tide. The empire itself cared little for the suffering of the conquered, so long as the flow of tribute continued. Soldiers were treated when possible, but the conquered were left to bury their dead and move on. Whole villages emptied, not by sword, but by fever. Families dwindled, fields lay fallow, and the silence of disease spread wider than the silence of massacre. The empire's networks, so carefully constructed for control, made retreat from plague impossible. Roads designed for swift messengers ensured that infection travelled just as swiftly. Relays of horses that carried orders from one end of the empire to the other also carried the germs of death. A cough in the east became a fever in the west within months. No wall could stop it, no decree could slow it. The same system that bound the empire in obedience bound it also in shared vulnerability. For the conquered, disease deepened the sense that life under the Mongols was a death sentence, no matter the form. Surrender or rebellion, loyalty or silence, none of it mattered when illness arrived. Mothers lost children, children lost parents, and households collapsed into grief without warning. Survivors staggered on, weaker, more desperate, and more convinced that fate itself had turned against them. And all the while, the empire pressed forward, its soldiers scarcely pausing even as their own numbers thinned. Plague and conquest together reshaped the landscape. Cities that had thrived as centres of trade became hushed and hollow, their marketplaces abandoned, their gates marked by the stench of decay. Farmlands once rich with harvest became stretches of neglected soil. Where once neighbours gathered in festivals or markets, now silence hung heavy, broken only by the tolling of bells or the cries of mourners. Life did not simply bend under Mongol rule. It unravelled in ways too vast to measure. And still the empire endured. The Khans saw disease as no enemy of theirs, but as another tool of fear. If pestilence weakened their subjects, it made rebellion less likely. If cities lost half their people, they became easier to control. To the rulers, the dead were numbers, reminders of mortality, but not threats to power. It was only the ordinary people, caught between soldier and sickness, who bore the full weight of despair. Living in such a time meant learning that death could arrive in silence. It did not always roar with the thunder of hooves or the blaze of fire. Sometimes it slipped in quietly, carried by a cough, a flea, a sip of water drawn from a tainted well. In such a world, no amount of obedience, no depth of submission could guarantee survival. The empire had made the earth smaller, binding it together with roads and orders, but in that smallness, it also made humanity more fragile. The plagues that followed the Mongols were not mere accidents of history. They were part of the tapestry of empire, woven into the very structure of its rule. Just as tribute drained villages of their wealth, disease drained them of their life. Together they created a world where living itself felt uncertain, where each sunrise carried the question of whether one would live to see its end. The Mongol armies did not simply conquer, they consumed. Their victories were not marked only by fallen walls or surrendered rulers, but by fire, vast, merciless fire that reduced kingdoms to ash and memory. Wherever the horsemen rode, flames followed, curling through wooden houses, temples, granaries and palaces, until entire landscapes glowed red against the night. To live beneath the shadow of such destruction was to know that one spark, one order, could erase a lifetime of labour, a city's pride, even the name of a people. The Mongols carried fire as readily as they carried the bow. Siege engines hurled not only stones but bundles of burning pitch, their arcs lighting the sky above besieged towns. Once gates were broken and soldiers poured through, torches followed, pressed into thatched roofs, and flung into storerooms. The act was deliberate, systematic. Conquest was not complete until resistance was impossible, and nothing stripped a people of resistance like the loss of shelter and sustenance. A city without homes or harvest was no city at all. It was rubble dressed in smoke. The terror of fire was as much psychological as physical. Villages whispered of entire cities that had vanished in a single night, their inhabitants slaughtered, their structures reduced to embers visible for miles. The knowledge that defiance could end in annihilation broke spirits before battles were even fought. Some rulers surrendered at the mere rumour of approaching flames, preferring submission over the sight of their capitals burning beneath the hooves of invaders. Yet fire was not only a tool of punishment, it was also a marker of dominance. The Mongols did not build monuments in the lands they conquered. They left behind smouldering ruins as proof of their reach. Where earlier empires might have raised temples or palaces, the Mongols left the memory of smoke hanging in the air, a grim reminder that their rule did not need stone to be remembered. The absence itself, the hollow spaces where thriving centres had once stood, became their legacy. Those who survived such destruction carried its scars not just on their bodies, but in their daily lives. Farmers returning to fields found their tools reduced to blackened shapes, their homes to skeletal frames of timber. Entire harvests vanished in the flames, leaving famine to complete what fire had begun. Markets that once bustled with voices became empty squares. Their stalls collapsed, their goods turned to ash. The work of generations disappeared in hours, and the survivors were left to rebuild under the same empire that had destroyed them. For the Mongols, fire was efficient. It consumed quickly, left little for enemies to reclaim, and spread fear farther than any army could ride. News of cities reduced to ash travelled faster than the soldiers themselves, softening targets before the invaders even arrived. The fear of fire often did more work than fire itself, compelling towns to open their gates without a fight, rulers to submit without negotiation. The choice was clear: bow and survive, or resist and burn. Yet even surrender did not always spare a city. The Khans judged loyalty not only by words, but by absolute submission. A single act of hesitation, a rumour of betrayal, could be enough to condemn a population, and when punishment was chosen, fire was merciless. Surrendered towns watched helplessly as their own homes ignited, the empire proving that mercy was not promised, only obedience enforced. The memory of flames haunted entire regions. In Persia, cities that had once shone with wealth and culture became wastelands. In Eastern Europe, villages burned along the paths of retreating armies, ensuring that even pursuit would be met with starvation. In China, wooden structures turned siege into infernos, spreading faster than defenders could contain. Each land had its own story of fire, but together they painted a single truth. Life beneath the Mongols was always one spark away from ruin. For ordinary people, the knowledge of this danger shaped how they lived. They stored less in their homes, fearing it might be stolen or burned. They built shelters quickly, with little adornment, knowing permanence was an illusion. Families kept valuables small and portable: jewellery, coins, tools, anything that could be carried in flight. Even faith itself shifted. Temples were rebuilt in modest forms, prayers offered not for prosperity, but simply for survival. The empire thrived on this uncertainty. By ensuring that no settlement felt secure, the Mongols made resistance unthinkable. Fire was not simply destruction, it was control, erasing not only structures, but the very sense of safety that might inspire rebellion. People learnt to live lightly, to expect loss, to bend before the empire's winds rather than risk standing firm. Yet, amid this desolation, the paradox of Mongol rule persisted. The same empire that burned cities also safeguarded trade routes, protected merchants, and imposed a kind of order across vast distances. Caravans passed through lands where once flames had raged, carrying goods between hushed towns that rebuilt under ashes. The contrast was stark. Safety for the empire's chosen, devastation for its doubters, and for the conquered, the lesson was cruelly simple. Prosperity came only in submission, and even then, fire always loomed. Living under such a system was like dwelling in a house where the walls were soaked in oil, where every day carried the possibility that someone might strike a match. Life could appear calm, fields replanted, markets reopened, children playing in the dust, but beneath it all smouldered the memory of what had been lost, and the knowledge that it could be lost again at any moment. The fires that erased kingdoms did more than destroy. They hollowed the spirit of nations. They turned thriving cultures into fragments, reduced proud rulers into trembling vassals, and left ordinary people wandering through landscapes of ash. And in that smoke, the Mongol Empire's power was etched, not in monuments of stone, but in the silence of ruins, in the emptiness where kingdoms once stood. The Mongol Empire did not simply seize land and wealth. It claimed people too, especially the young. Children of the conquered became one of the most haunting symbols of life under Mongol rule, for they carried both the scars of defeat and the uncertain future of their shattered communities. To be born into a kingdom targeted by the horsemen was to be born into uncertainty, where one's fate could swing from slavery to assimilation, from exile to forced service, without warning. The armies that thundered across the steppes and valleys did not leave the youngest untouched. When cities were sacked, it was often the children who survived, not by mercy, but by design. To the Mongols, they were resources, future servants, soldiers, interpreters, or bargaining tools. Their lives were not valued as children, but as extensions of imperial need. And so many were seized, torn from the arms of grieving parents, marched away with columns of captives toward horizons they could not understand. Some were absorbed into the Mongol household structure, raised alongside the offspring of warriors, taught to ride, hunt, and obey the code of their conquerors. In this way, the empire grew not only through fire and death, but through the moulding of new generations whose earliest memories were of submission. These children carried dual identities, born of conquered lands, but reshaped in the image of those who had burned their homes. Their tongues twisted into the Mongol language, their loyalties bent toward distant Khans. Yet beneath it all, memories of parents and villages lingered like faint echoes, suppressed but never erased. For those not absorbed, the fate was harsher still. Children filled the ranks of slaves, burdened with menial tasks in households across the empire. They carried water, tended animals, and hauled loads too heavy for small shoulders. Their names were often stripped away, replaced with titles of function, boy, girl, servant, until identity itself became smoke in the wind. Unlike wealth, which could be replenished, or cities, which could be rebuilt, the childhood lost under Mongol hands could never be restored. The fear of losing children became another form of control over conquered populations. Parents lived in constant dread that disobedience would mean the seizure of their sons and daughters. Entire communities submitted quietly, their resistance extinguished by the unspoken threat of watching their young carried away. A father might endure higher taxes, a mother might surrender her harvest, if only it meant keeping the family intact. Yet even submission was no guarantee. The Khan's officials decided, and once chosen, no plea could change the outcome. The psychological toll stretched across generations. Those who grew up under Mongol command often found themselves torn between worlds. A child raised in the saddle of his captor might one day return to raid the very region of his birth, his bow turned against the soil where his ancestors rested. A daughter carried to a distant encampment might be wed into the very family that had destroyed her village, her children born heirs to a conqueror's line rather than her own people's legacy. In this way, the Mongol conquest not only subdued kingdoms, but hollowed them from within, redirecting their future into the veins of the empire. Stories of such fates spread as widely as the fires that erased cities. In whispered tales, mothers spoke of children who vanished into the horizon, never to be seen again. Some were said to have grown into soldiers who no longer recognized their kin. others into servants who forgot their mother tongues, others into figures of wealth and power who could not return home, bound forever by loyalty to their captors. These stories lingered not as myths, but as warnings. To lose a child to the Mongols was to lose not only family, but the future itself. Even those who remained in their homelands bore the weight of conquest. Children grew up in landscapes scarred by ash, learning early that safety was an illusion. Their play was muted, their laughter quiet, for even joy seemed dangerous when the Empire's gaze could fall at any time. They were taught submission before they were taught song, obedience before they were taught prayer. The lessons of childhood were not of freedom or imagination, but of survival. When to bow, when to yield, when to remain silent. The Empire's demand for control seeped into their daily existence. Boys were measured for their strength, eyed as potential recruits. Girls were appraised for beauty or usefulness. Their futures decided not by family, but by the needs of the Khan's court. Childhood became less a time of innocence than of waiting, the uncertainty of when and how the empire would claim its due. And all the while, parents endured the slow torment of watching their children live beneath a shadow that no love could lift. In this way, the Mongols ensured that their conquest was not only of land and gold, but of generations. The children of the conquered carried the empire forward, whether as servants, soldiers, or silent witnesses to its reach. They embodied the transformation of entire cultures into tributaries of Mongol power, living proof that resistance was futile, and survival came only through submission. Yet beneath that forced loyalty, there always smouldered the unspoken grief of peoples who had lost their heirs, their names, their futures to the empire's unrelenting grasp. Life under the Mongols was already harsh, burdened by taxes, scarred by fire, haunted by the threat of punishment. But for many, the deepest wound was not in what was taken from the present, but in what was stolen from tomorrow. For when the children of the conquered were no longer their own, an entire people lived as if their future had been erased, one small hand at a time, and peace beneath the Mongols was never truly peace. It was a silence pressed down by fear, a calm that existed only because no one dared disturb it. For those who bent their heads and swore loyalty, there was the illusion of stability, but like a thin layer of ice on a river, it could shatter at the slightest weight. Submission spared lives, but it chained them to uncertainty, for the empire's mercy was fickle and its demands unending. Cities that surrendered without resistance were often spared the flames that consumed their neighbours. Gates opened, tributes were offered, and officials came forward bearing the keys of their towns in trembling hands. In these moments, Mongol envoys might declare that the people would be left unharmed. Yet even in this gesture, there was no true safety. A promise of protection meant little when it could be withdrawn at the whim of a commander, or undone by a rumour of disloyalty. Those who survived conquest carried the weight of gratitude and dread in equal measure, never certain whether their submission had bought time or simply postponed their destruction. The fragile peace manifested in daily life. Markets reopened, but the sound of bargaining was muted, as though every trader feared his words might carry farther than intended it. Farmers returned to their fields, but planted cautiously, knowing that the fruits of their labour might be seized without warning. Craftsmen bent over their work with lowered eyes, producing goods that would fill Mongol stores before ever reaching local hands. Life went on, but it was a life reduced, flattened beneath the awareness that everything depended on the favour of distant rulers who might never set foot in the lands they controlled. To the conquerors, this silence was victory. An obedient people, subdued not only in arms but in spirit, required fewer soldiers to watch them. Yet for the conquered, silence was suffocating. It was the quiet of a household where every creak of wood might be a footstep of authority, where every whisper might be overheard by someone eager to report disloyalty. Trust became fragile, even among neighbours. Families withdrew into themselves, speaking little, giving nothing away. A wrong word could be as dangerous as a drawn sword. The system of tribute reinforced this brittle arrangement. Each year, emissaries of the Khan arrived to collect what was owed: grain, livestock, coins, and sometimes even sons and daughters. These visits were not battles, yet they felt no less like invasions. The people lined up, presenting what they had gathered, hoping it would satisfy demands. To fall short, whether from poor harvest or hidden defiance, risked punishment that could undo the very peace submission was supposed to secure. A family might hand over its last stores of grain rather than face the wrath of soldiers, even if it meant hunger in the winter ahead. Some rulers tried to ease the burden on their people by negotiating lighter terms, but such bargains were unstable. The Mongols measured loyalty not in years of service, but in unwavering obedience. A single hesitation, a whisper of delay, could transform a peaceful town into a smouldering ruin overnight. The people lived on a knife's edge, their lives balanced between the demands of their conquerors and the desperate need to survive another season. The psychological strain of this existence was immense. Children grew up knowing that safety depended not on strength or wisdom, but on silence and compliance. Elders counselled caution in every matter, urging patience where once they might have urged pride. Songs grew softer, festivals fewer, as communities avoided anything that might draw the wrong kind of attention. Even joy itself seemed dangerous, a spark that might be mistaken for defiance. The empire benefited from this subdued existence. Trade routes stretched across conquered lands, caravans moving under the guarded peace of the Khan's rule. Merchants spoke of stability, of roads free from bandits, of markets open from one horizon to another. Yet this peace was uneven. For every trader who prospered, entire villages bent beneath taxes they could scarcely endure. The wealth of the Silk Road glittered brightly, but its shine was cast against the shadows of those who had surrendered everything simply to avoid destruction, and so submission became its own torment. To live meant to give, endlessly, until nothing remained but survival itself. There was no pride in it, no sense of dignity preserved. It was a peace built on fear, in which every household measured its safety not by walls or weapons, but by its ability to yield without protest. Resistance could mean fire and sword. Obedience meant a life stripped of freedom, lived always in the knowledge that the conqueror's hand could close tighter at any moment. This was the paradox that defined existence under the Mongols. Death was swift for those who defied them, but life was slow punishment for those who submitted. The fragility of peace lay in the fact that it belonged entirely to the empire, not to the people themselves. It was granted, and it could be withdrawn. The conquered did not live in their own world anymore. They lived in one borrowed from their rulers, and it was always one breath away from collapse. In such a world, even the quiet was heavy. Nights passed in stillness, broken only by the howl of distant winds across the steppe, a reminder of the horsemen who might one day return. Families slept lightly, their dreams haunted by the knowledge that their peace was not their own. It was not the peace of freedom, but the peace of submission, a fragile, brittle silence that cracked beneath the weight of fear, a silence that could never truly heal. In the stillness that followed conquest, silence rarely meant peace. Beneath the surface of towns rebuilt under Mongol watch, and in the hushed gatherings of villagers who spoke softly after nightfall, there lingered a question too dangerous to voice aloud. Could resistance ever be possible? The empire, vast and unrelenting, ruled with a presence that seemed unshakable, yet even within its iron grip, discontent brewed like embers beneath ash. Those embers were fragile, but the Mongols knew well that even the faintest spark of rebellion could consume an entire province. For that reason, they met whispers with punishments louder than any battle cry. The conquered lived under the weight of a truth they could never forget. Submission did not erase the memory of freedom. Farmers remembered the rulers who once taxed them less cruelly, merchants recalled cities that bustled without Mongol oversight, and nobles stripped of rank and honour carried quiet hatred within their gilded cages. From these memories, rebellion was born, though rarely spoken of in the light of day. It began in glances exchanged at the market, in coded words sewn into songs, in the careful gatherings of those who trusted one another. Yet all the while, they knew that betrayal was everywhere, for the Mongols had their watchers and informants scattered like shadows. In many villages, rumours spread faster than grain could be harvested. Stories of a local lord who might one day rise again, of distant kingdoms preparing armies to reclaim lost lands, of revolts already underway just over the horizon. These tales, whether true or false, fueled the imagination of the oppressed. But the Mongols allowed none of it to linger for long. Whenever such talk reached their ears, soldiers descended like a storm. A single careless phrase could doom an entire family. A single act of defiance could draw fire upon an entire settlement. Rebellion, even in its smallest form, was punished with severity meant to silence not only the guilty, but also those who merely witnessed their fate. The punishments themselves carried the weight of spectacle. When rebellion was uncovered, the guilty were not merely executed, they were displayed as a warning. Walls bore the hanging bodies of captured rebels. Town squares became stages where disobedience was met with death, in form so cruel that memory alone kept many from ever attempting the same. For the Mongols understood that fear was stronger than chains. Fear could keep thousands subdued where soldiers alone could not. Thus, punishments were chosen not simply for their cruelty, but for the echo they left in the minds of those forced to watch. Even small acts of defiance carried grave risks. Refusing to pay taxes, harbouring fugitives, hiding food meant for Mongol soldiers, all were treated as rebellion. Villages accused of shielding deserters sometimes saw their homes burned, not because they posed a real threat, but because the empire thrived on ensuring no one mistook leniency for weakness. The Mongols' power lay not only in armies that could sweep across continents, but in the certainty that rebellion would always cost more than submission. To resist was not merely to gamble with one's own life, it was to endanger the entire community. Still, there were those who tried. In the distant mountains, bands of fugitives gathered, hoping to carve out hidden enclaves where the Mongols could not reach. In forests and deserts, remnants of armies that had once resisted continued to fight, though with little hope of victory. They struck quickly, raiding supply caravans or ambushing small patrols, but such actions rarely went unanswered. The Mongols, relentless in pursuit, hunted them down with precision, and when they found them, they did not stop at the fighters alone. Families of rebels, towns rumoured to have given aid, and even neighbouring settlements who knew nothing of the struggle often suffered the same punishment. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion was a flame that would consume not only its bearer, but all those standing too close. The fear of such reprisals hollowed out courage before it could grow strong. Parents hushed their children when they asked questions about freedom. Songs of resistance were sung only in the faintest whispers, and even then, only to those beyond suspicion. The dream of throwing off Mongol rule became, in time, less a goal and more a fragile hope carried like a relic of the past. Most learned to live with the empire's weight upon them, not because they had forgotten rebellion, but because the punishment it invited was too immense to risk. Yet for the Mongols, punishment was not solely about quelling disobedience. It was about reminding all who lived under their rule that they were watched. Even when no rebellion stirred, executions, displays of authority, and acts of terror were woven into daily life. It was a ritual as much as a policy, keeping fear fresh, ensuring that memories of violence did not fade into complacency. The quietest village, where no resistance had ever been attempted, might suddenly find itself chosen for punishment if suspicion lingered too long. Innocence was no shield, for suspicion alone was enough to invite wrath. And so whispers persisted, but they carried the tone of resignation more often than resolve. Resistance became a story to be passed down, a tale told not as a promise of change, but as a memory of what once was. People spoke of brave souls who had risen against the empire, but always with the reminder that they had perished, and that their sacrifice had brought ruin to all around them. These stories served less as inspiration and more as warnings, teaching each new generation to guard their words, to accept the empire's rule, and to fear the punishment that rebellion invited. Under such conditions, the conquered lived in a paradox. They longed for freedom, but had learned to fear the very thought of pursuing it. They whispered of rebellion, but knew that silence was safer. In this way, the Mongols ruled not only through the strength of their armies, but through the chains of dread that bound the spirit. It was a world where rebellion did not vanish, but where every act of resistance was suffocated before it could breathe, drowned beneath punishments so vast that even the survivors carried them like scars. In the shadow of the empire, life became a delicate balance between the urge to resist and the instinct to survive, between whispers of hope and the silence demanded by fear. The Mongols had mastered more than conquest. They had mastered the art of ensuring that rebellion remained forever unfinished, a thought half-spoken, a dream that dissolved before morning light. For those who lived under their gaze, existence itself was measured not by freedom, but by the unending caution of survival, where even whispers carried the weight of death. Life beneath the Mongol banner was never free from the shadow of war. Even in conquered lands where battles no longer raged, the rhythm of daily existence was bound to the empire's hunger for more. Peace was never the goal of conquest. It was merely a pause between campaigns. Villages rebuilt from ashes were soon emptied of their strongest men, drafted into service for wars far from home. Families already hollowed by famine and tribute now faced the prospect of losing sons to a battlefield they would never see, fighting under a banner that was not their own. The empire's reach stretched endlessly, and so too did its demands. Soldiers rode east into lands of forests and rivers, west toward deserts and cities fortified with stone, south into mountains where resistance lingered. For those pressed into service, there was no promise of return. The Mongol army moved swiftly, but death travelled faster, and the fallen were left unburied on distant fields where no kin could mourn them. Mothers spoke of sons as though they were already lost when the summons came, for the call to war was less a duty than a sentence. Even those who remained behind bore the weight of the campaigns. Armies required grain, livestock, weapons, and endless streams of supplies. Fields were stripped bare, granaries emptied, herds driven away. Families tightened belts through winters, knowing their labour had gone not to their own survival, but to feed the riders of empire. Villages that resisted these demands were marked as disloyal and punished as rebels, for refusal to fuel the wars was seen as rebellion itself. Thus the conquered were bound not only to endure their own suffering, but to sustain the very force that oppressed them. The endless campaigns devoured more than resources. They consumed the spirit of the people. Each victory celebrated by the empire meant another province bled dry, another people brought beneath the yoke, and always more soldiers taken from among the conquered. The cycle was relentless, with no horizon of peace in sight. Generations grew up knowing nothing but the empire's demands, their lives measured in campaigns they had not chosen, their fates tied to distant battles whose causes were whispered but never understood. Within the Mongol ranks, discipline was unyielding. Soldiers drawn from conquered peoples were watched closely, never trusted fully, always reminded that disobedience meant swift death. Yet many marched regardless, for refusal meant death at home, while service at least carried the faint chance of survival. But service was no path to honour. The conquered fought as tools, expendable and easily replaced. Victories were credited to the Khan, defeats punished upon the weakest. For those conscripted, war was not glory but endurance. Each battle survived only to be followed by another. And while soldiers fell on foreign soil, their absence hollowed out the villages they left behind. Fields went untilled, children grew without fathers, and communities that once thrived shrank into quiet shells. Women bore heavier burdens, tending farms, raising families, and enduring the endless grief of waiting for news that never came. Many learned not to wait at all, for silence was often the only message war delivered. Life at home was war by another name: war against hunger, war against exhaustion, war against despair. The empire itself thrived on this constant expansion. Conquest fed conquest, each new territory offering wealth, slaves, and tribute to fund the next campaign. To stop was to weaken, and so the wars continued. An endless chain stretched across the horizon. Yet for those beneath the empire's rule, the weight grew unbearable. They were caught in the grinding gears of a machine that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. War was not a distant affair. It pressed upon every household, shaping the rhythm of seasons, dictating whether families would eat, and deciding whether sons would live to see another year. The psychological burden was immense. Children grew up with war as a constant backdrop, its presence woven into lullabies, into the silence of their mothers, into the empty seats around the hearth. Hope itself became fragile, eroded by the knowledge that tomorrow might bring another summons, another levy, another war in a place whose name they had never heard. To dream of peace was to dream of something that no longer existed. The Mongols, masters of movement, never allowed stillness. Their armies flowed like rivers, and the conquered were forced to flow with them. Resistance was crushed, submission drained, and service demanded until nothing remained but survival itself. The empire's strength lay in this ceaseless momentum, but for those who lived within it, the motion was suffocating. They were pulled along by wars that were not theirs, carried to fates they could not choose, bound forever to battles they did not start. In the end, life under Mongol rule was less about living than enduring. Each family bore the weight of wars that stretched beyond sight, wars that consumed fathers, sons, and the very grain from their fields. The empire called it glory, but for those who suffered beneath it, the word held no meaning. War was the air they breathed, the shadow they walked beneath, the burden they carried until it broke them. And in that endless cycle, where conquest fed conquest, and the people were little more than fuel for the empire's fire, life itself became a death sentence, written not with swords alone, but with the unrelenting weight of endless wars. Wherever the hooves of Mongol horses thundered, fire was never far behind. It rolled across plains, swept through cities, and consumed forests, leaving behind landscapes so blackened that they seemed to bleed into the night sky. For the conquered, War was not only the loss of battles or the weight of tribute, it was the transformation of entire worlds into ash. The empire's power was measured not only in armies won or kingdoms subdued, but in the silence that followed destruction. A silence broken only by the crackle of ruins. The advance of the Mongols was rarely subtle. Smoke on the horizon became the first signal of their presence. Villages learned to fear the rising columns long before the riders arrived, for fire was both weapon and warning. To resist meant flames. To shelter fugitives meant flames. To hesitate in surrender meant flames. The fires erased not only lives, but memory itself. For when a city was reduced to ash, its stories were lost, its walls levelled, and its people scattered to the winds. From China's fertile river valleys to the plains of Eastern Europe, this pattern repeated with chilling precision. Entire settlements were swallowed by firestorms that devoured wood, cloth, and grain in moments, sparing only the stone skeletons of the largest cities. Those who escaped with their lives often carried nothing but the smoke still clinging to their clothes. And in their wake, famine followed. Blackened fields could not be replanted quickly. Granaries turned to soot. Herds stolen or slaughtered. For survivors, the fire burned long after the flames had died, for hunger was its slower twin. There was no place too distant to escape this fate. The Mongols moved with such speed that fire spread across continents as swiftly as rumour. Merchants travelling roads, once alive with trade, now found paths lined with ruins. Wells were choked with ash, bridges collapsed, and entire stretches of countryside lay empty. The empire's appetite for war left scars so vast that even the earth itself seemed weary beneath it. Some lands never fully recovered, their towns abandoned, their fields grown wild again, their names forgotten by all but the grieving. For those within the empire, the memory of burning lingered like a constant shadow. Even in places that had long since submitted, the fear of fire kept obedience alive. People rebuilt with caution, never daring to believe their walls would protect them. The empire made examples of cities that resisted, ensuring that tales of their destruction spread faster than their ashes. These stories travelled on the lips of merchants, carried in the memories of refugees, whispered to children as warnings. Fire became not merely a punishment, but a presence that lived in imagination, a terror as real as any sword. And yet, the fires served another purpose. They cleared the land for new rulers, erasing what had once been so completely that the empire could plant its own order upon the ruins. Old loyalties disappeared with the ashes. Old dynasties became nothing more than smoke rising into the air. Survivors had little choice but to bend to the conquerors, their homes too fragile, their strength too broken to resist again. The Mongols understood this deeply. Destruction was not an accident of war, but a deliberate foundation for their dominion. Still, beneath the ashes, people endured. They huddled in the remains of villages, dug into the earth for food, rebuilt shelters from scraps of what survived. Life clung stubbornly even to the blackened earth, though never in the same way as before. Families who had once lived for generations in the same place now wandered as refugees, carrying their stories on weary tongues, retelling them not to preserve glory, but to make sense of the ruin that surrounded them. The land itself became haunted, not by spirits, but by the memory of lives that had been erased. The fires also reshaped the flow of history. Entire kingdoms vanished into smoke, their rulers dead or fled, their palaces crumbled to ash. Trade routes shifted as once thriving centres became desolate ruins. Scholars spoke of knowledge lost, libraries burned, and traditions cut short by flames that cared nothing for parchment or stone. Even faith was touched by fire. As temples and shrines fell, their gods left homeless alongside their worshippers. In this way, the Mongol conquests did not merely destroy, they rewrote the very map of culture and memory. But the empire, for all its might, could not escape the echo of its own destruction. The very lands it left in ruin yielded less tribute, fewer supplies, less strength for future wars. Ashes could not feed armies. Burned fields could not sustain growth. The empire's hunger was boundless, but fire devoured not only the enemy, it devoured the resources that even conquerors required. The people beneath Mongol rule carried this burden most of all, for they were made to rebuild what had been lost, only to watch it taken again when the next campaign began. For the ordinary soul, survival meant living always in the shadow of potential fire. The sky itself could turn red without warning, and in that red glow came the end of everything familiar. A child might grow up never knowing a permanent home, always moving from one place to another, each marked by the faint smell of soot. An old man might die remembering the city of his youth, its towers and markets, now nothing but scorched earth. The weight of ashes became part of life itself, shaping not only what people had, but how they thought, how they prayed, how they feared. And across continents, the trail of fire remained, a dark line cutting through history. The Mongols had built an empire greater than any before, but its foundation was laid on ruins, its roads paved with cinders, its legacy etched into the charred remains of cities that once stood proud. For those who lived through it, life was a slow endurance in the aftermath of destruction, where the memory of fire was always close, ready to rise again at the first sign of disobedience. Ashes did not fade quickly. They lingered in the soil, in the stories, in the air itself. They clung to the living as much as to the dead, a constant reminder that under the Mongol Empire, survival was not measured in victories or in peace, but in how long one could stand amidst the ruins, breathing smoke and carrying on in a world remade by fire. The story of life under the Mongol Empire is not just about battles or the rise of a vast dominion. It is about the small and fragile details of human life, swept away under a power that seemed impossible to resist. We walked together through kingdoms that thought themselves eternal, and saw how quickly they were reduced to ashes. We glimpsed the children of the conquered, who grew up in silence under a rule that demanded obedience. We followed the uneasy peace of submission, where survival meant bowing one's head, even as whispers of rebellion carried the weight of punishment. And across continents, we watched as smoke and fire became a language that entire cities understood too well. What lingers, even now, is the quiet recognition that for millions of ordinary people, history was not written in triumphs. It was written in fear, in endurance, and in the fragile hope of surviving another day. These are not loud stories. They do not end with victory. They are the soft echoes of lives lived under shadows, reminders that for much of history, survival itself was the only achievement. As we close tonight's journey, I invite you to rest with these thoughts, not as heavy burdens, but as drifting fragments of memory, carried like dust across time. And now, if you found calm in this quiet path through the past, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps these forgotten stories reach others who may need them, and it keeps this small circle of listeners connected across the world. Thank you for being here, wherever you are, in whatever hour of night. May your rest be gentle, and may the stories of the past keep you company until sleep arrives.